Hey everybody, John Raridan here for Nintendo World Report TV, and the other day was the preview embargo for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. So a bunch of publications got invited to play a demo of what seems to be an early part of Metroid Prime 4, probably just the beginning of the game. Seems like maybe a couple hours or so. Now, full disclosure, we weren't invited, not bitter. But naturally, I went and read some of the previews because I'm interested in Metroid Prime 4. Alongside those previews was also a new overview trailer, which covered a lot of the same content. Now, I watched the overview trailer, and my takeaway is pretty positive. One of the things that I personally, on sort of just a technical art design level, was really interested in was whether Metroid Prime 4 would go with sort of the super, photorealistic style that the original Metroid Prime was going for. Because yes, that Samus at the end of the original Metroid Prime was pretty darn realistic for that era of GameCube game. Or if they would pivot to sort of the cartoony style that Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Prime 3 employed. In those later games, they kind of shifted the look of Samus to make her look a bit more like she did in Super Smash Bros. And in Metroid Zero Mission, dropping that more realistic take on the character that they had in the first game. So when we saw these Federation troops with their helmet visors up and we see their actual face, I was pretty surprised just how realistic they actually looks. Honestly, character rendering, really impressive. Now, this trailer was using the Switch 2 version of the game, but as far as we know, the only real major difference as far as, Switch 2 versus Switch 1 is actual rendering resolution, frame rate, HDR, of course, and some minor changes to texture resolution. So I'm curious how these characters will actually look on Switch 1 as well, because they look really, really darn good. But those characters were also the source of some debate, because based on what some of the previews were saying, they're annoying. But also there was sort of this perception that, Metroid is a solitary game, and when you bring other characters in like this, it breaks that solitary experience. Well, I'm here to say that hasn't been how Metroid Prime has been for a long time. So as these previews are presenting it, these characters are constantly in communication with Samus, telling her where to go, telling her where she's missed something, you're interacting with them, and there's, all these other characters in the world with you, and it kind of ruins what many view as a very solitary style game. And I think a lot of that comes from Metroid Prime 1, which is an extremely solitary game. When the original Metroid Prime came out on GameCube, it actually reminded me a lot of Myst, even though one is a shooter and one is a pure first-person adventure game. But it had a similar feeling of just isolation and loneliness. And I think the fact that for a lot of people, the only Metroid Prime game they've played, or at least the only one they've played recently, though I suspect there are a lot of people who have literally only played Metroid Prime Remastered on the Switch. Because you have to remember, even the most recent Metroid Prime numbered game, Metroid Prime 3, is nearly 20 years old. So there's a lot of people where Metroid Prime Remastered, which came out a couple years ago on Switch, is their entire experience with Metroid Prime. And so to them, Metroid Prime is this super solitary experience. But if you've played the rest of that trilogy, you know that in Metroid Prime 2, your entire initial motivation in Metroid Prime 2 is to find these missing Federation Marines, who you encounter, though granted they're largely dead. But then you also interact with living members of an alien race in that game, so there are secondary characters in that game. Metroid Prime 3, even more so. And you are regularly interacting with characters in that game for the major story moments. Between those story moments is where the isolation is, and that's just like it was in the original Metroid Prime, and it's the same for Metroid Prime 2. So something that one of our staff members here at NWR, Melanie Zawodniak, actually commented on Blue Sky is if you gave a bunch of press in, 2006, 2007, the opening couple hours of Metroid Prime 3, you would get very similar previews to what we saw today for Metroid Prime 4. And I think that's a great observation. And I think it's 100% correct. At the very start of Metroid Prime 3, Samus lands on the GFS Olympus. It's a big Federation ship amidst this massive Federation fleet. You meet with Admiral Dane, you meet with other hunters, you meet with Federation troops. There's a bunch of characters on that ship. And you're going through this thing after you land where they're saying, hey, go here, go here, go here, go here. There's a couple little puzzles along the way, but it's entirely linear. Eventually, that ship and the fleet is attacked by space pirates, and you wind up leaving the ship and going down to the planet below, which is called Norian. And you have a sort of little linear adventure down there. This whole thing lasts for probably an hour or two. It's a fairly substantial part of the game. And if you were to just play that chunk of the game, that opening intro to the game, you would assume this is a very linear, very story-heavy, cutscene-heavy, dialogue-heavy game where characters are constantly talking to you. Now, what's fun is that NWR is a pretty old website, and so we don't actually have to do this as a thought experiment. We can just go look, because guess what part of the game Nintendo demoed for at least one of their E3 demos? That's right, it was this section of the beginning of the game. And if you look at a lot of the hands-on previews, they all mention this, that it seems very linear and very story-focused. But here's the difference, because we're good at this, and Nintendo, you should invite us to your events, is that all of our previews mention, hey, we're pretty sure this is the beginning of the game and likely isn't indicative of the entire experience. Which, when Metroid Prime 3 came out, is true. Yeah. There are moments in that game where you are involved in a larger story with a bunch of characters. The vast majority of it, however, you're alone on a planet. And it makes those moments where those other characters show up feel pretty special. Some light spoilers for Metroid Prime 3, but towards the end of the game, you're actually grouped up with a bunch of Federation soldiers fighting your way towards sort of the end game. And it's really cool. Like, Metroid Prime I would not consider a first-person shooter. I think it's actually closer to something like Myst than it is to something like Halo. But because it has those mechanics, it's kind of cool when the game just takes a moment to give you that, power fantasy of shooting your way through a bunch of space pirates. It's something that the 2D games actually do really well. Because, a little aside here, I guess I'm getting distracted, but that first Metroid Prime doesn't control like a first-person shooter, or at least it didn't on the original GameCube, and it was much more focused on that first-person adventure. But if you go back to something like Super Metroid, that game is equal parts, exploration, some light puzzle-solving, stuff like that, but it's also Contra. Like, it's not like that game isn't a shooter. And so as Metroid Prime developed, and especially on the Wii, once they had the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and they did have much more traditional first-person shooter controls, they embraced a little bit of that. Not for most of the game, but every once in a while they would bring in a, kind of a set-piece moment that lets you have that experience of fighting through a bunch of space pirates as Samus. That's something that the 2D games did a lot at the, especially the end of the game, is have you go through a bunch of areas you had already been, just blasting stuff as a fully powered up Samus. It's kind of a trope in Metroid, and it's not as common in the Prime sub-series, but, it happens. Anyway, all that to say, when the game does have these set-piece moments with a bunch of characters, they feel special because you've been alone for a long time, and it's sort of a cool reward. I suspect that Metroid Prime 4 will be doing a lot of the same thing. We've seen a few characters that Samus is rescuing along the way. I kind of expect that maybe there will be like one or two of these characters per area that go back to sort of what we've already seen as likely a sort of home base. And I'm also pretty sure that all of these people are going to die. Like, you don't have dialogue from all the characters talking about how excited they are to get home and then not kill them. So, if you don't like these characters, I don't think they're going to be around for the whole time. Now, will that be exactly how Metroid Prime 4 plays out? We'll see. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the previews that we are basing this concern on about there being all these other characters and they're constantly talking to Samus and you don't feel that isolation, you don't have the freedom to solve puzzles, is coming from a bunch of previews that were more or less seemingly based on the tutorial, right? Like, imagine your favorite game and then just imagine how you would perceive that entire game if your only point of reference for it was like the very, 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 very beginning of it. Like, the original Star Fox would be a game about flying through an area with no enemies that just loops endlessly and you go through rings and everybody tells you to stay in formation. Ocarina of Time would be a game about a quaint little forest village and a tree that definitely never dies. Heck, even Metroid Prime 1 would be an extremely linear game about exploring this abandoned space station, and then you fight Ridley and that's the end of the game. So I want to be clear that I'm not knocking these people's perception of the games. Obviously, when you're writing a preview, you can only write it based on what you've seen, but it is important both as journalists and as viewers that we keep some context around what we've seen. So, if this is a concern for you in Metroid Prime 4, I wouldn't be that worried. The way they're presenting this narrative seems to me to be pretty much in line with where the franchise was the last time we left it, so I'm not really that worried. And beyond that, I think that trailer looks pretty good, and I'm glad they've finally given us this nice long look at the game. We've had a lot of 1-minute trailers for this game, and it's cool to get something a little bit more substantial. I am legitimately very interested in the story. I've always loved the look of the Federation Troopers armor, so it's cool to see that looking all 4K and nice. And of course, Sylux. He's a beautiful boy, and I'm excited to see him finally get some time in the sun. But that's all I've got. Let me know what you thought about that overview trailer down in the comments. If you're looking for more Metroid content to fill your mind as you wait for Metroid Prime 4, we've got a bunch of it here. I just did a replay of Metroid Prime Hunters and did a little video kind of exploring that game and my 2025 thoughts on it that you can check out. I also have a video exploring all of the lore of Sylux, which might be cool to watch before this comes out. You can even go and watch our original GameCube review of Metroid Prime from way back in the day, or my review of Metroid Prime Remastered from less back in the day. You can check out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more. You can join our Discord down in the description to chat with us about this or anything else Nintendo related. If you want to reach out to me specifically, you can use the handle that's somewhere on screen to reach out on your social media platform of choice. Once again, my name's John Reardon. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.
This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.